Hey, it's Kat, and I'm back because what once was will be again. I got my thinking cap on so we can use history to divine the mysteries of the Game of Thrones. And I'm going to make this a two-parter because I realized I was just going too damn long. Going through this. It's a little bit of a free flow. So I want to talk about who's Jon Snow and or who's Daenerys for that matter. What's their parentage? Because I do believe that there's a bunch of questions still involved here. And if you saw my video, Battle of the Bastards Part 1, who is Jon Snow playing right now? It's Henry Tudor. But as I was reviewing some of the aspects that Mr. Martin, he likes to mix and match his characters up. And he doesn't just take this male character in history and plant it on a particular character and give them all of their story arc. He likes to mix it up, not just amongst people, but also amongst the genders. So in some respects, some of the females are playing, are doing some male parts or taking some action that belong to a guy in history, and some of the guys are taking parts that belong to women in history. So as a for instance, I ran down the line, and you have to go back and check it out, about Henry Tudor and the parts of his story that reflect Jon Snow. And the big ones for me was that Henry Tudor's grandmother, Catherine of Valois, when she was pregnant with her third child, actually, she was placed in the abbey. She was arrested by the Yorkists, who were in control at that time because they were afraid she was trying to get control of Henry VI, the Mad King. And maybe she was, or maybe she was just trying to get in touch with her son and make sure her other children were, got something, were protected somehow. But in any event, she was arrested and thrown in an abbey where she gave birth to her last child. It was actually her fourth child, I'm sorry, that died in childbirth, and she died as well. And it kind of reminded me a little bit of the Lyanna Stark story. But the other parts that, and then he was raised by his uncle, Ned Stark, which is the same thing that happened to Henry Tudor. He was raised by his uncle, Jasper Tudor, because his dad died before he was even born. Okay? So, but at the same time, he's got some Elizabeth of York character lines as well. So, if you count the fact that he's one of 7 children amongst the Starks, and that I said in that video that the Rickon and Brandon seem to have played the princes in the tower because they were allegedly killed, and then they're off somewhere and nobody knows where, but a lot of people think that they're dead, even though we clearly see Bran's alive. But there were people who questioned whether the princes were dead or were spirited away somewhere and still out there. And in fact, imposters came back later claiming to be the princes in the tower. So you get that whole aspect right there. And it's sort of, if you think about Jon Snow being up in, and this is a super stretch, but being up there on the wall, kind of being in sanctuary, the same way that Elizabeth York was through much of this little struggle with Edward IV coming to the throne and then Richard III. But the big one is that he has the Hound. He has the wolf that's kind of like the Hound in the story. And in this Henry Tudor and Elizabeth of York line, it is Elizabeth of York that has the Hound as her representation as part of the Yorkist line and the English line, while Henry Tudor was the one that raised the dragon banner at the Battle of Bosworth, which I said is kind of like the Battle of the Bastards that's coming up. And, through his claim with the Welsh. And we clearly see that it's Daenerys who has the dragon banner. And you have to see the symbol. We know this is the War of the Roses, and we know that the War of the Roses closed out with the marriage of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, and that he had caused to be made this coat of arms that was the Dragon of Wales and the Hound of England. All right, so symbols that are in your face, and you need to keep this in mind because I'm going to talk about that in part 2. So the other part that clearly he's given parts of Henry Tudor's storyline to Daenerys as well. For instance, she's over in Essos, which we can equate to Europe at this point. And at about the age of 14, Jasper Tudor took Henry Tudor over to France to escape potential assassination. Sort of like what's going on in the background with Daenerys. And more importantly, while he was over there keeping, being kept by, the King of France and some other potential allies who just sort of like was keeping around like a potential thorn in Edward IV's side. While he was over there were 3 attempts on his life. And you might question why Edward IV would be interested in this dude, Henry Tudor, who's had such a slim claim to the throne. But there were so many of these others out there that had a fairly slim claim as well, that were constantly raising rebellions, and he had to put them all down. He either defeated them in battle or had them thrown in the tower and then later executed, right? So he's pretty much at this point consolidating his claim on the throne and eliminating all the potential threats. And to be honest, Jasper Tudor and Margaret Beaufort, they were just not the kind that gave up. Jasper Tudor had been one that was like loyal to Henry VI and Margaret of Anjou and their son Prince Edward all the way to the freaking end. And they were finally killed, but he still didn't even give up. And you know why that was, is because it was the Yorks who had thrown his mother in the abbey, who died in childbirth. I don't think he ever forgave them. And I think maybe his father, Owen Tudor, who had been in love with Catherine, when they got married, ever did either, and probably conveyed that down to them. But in any event, they didn't give up, and I believe that Edward IV understood that they weren't going to give up. So they went to France, and there were 3 attempts on on Henry Tudor's life, just like there was 3 attempts on Daenerys' life. And again, like I said, and she has that big freaking dragon banner, so it's almost like he's flipped their aspects. He's given Jon Snow her the Hound and her the dragon. And Henry Tudor had cause to be made this coat of arms. Well, the other thing that came to mind as I was thinking about this is the whole who's who and whose potential parents there are. Because when Henry Tudor came to the throne, he did have such a little claim through his mother, and it was a bastard line from a 3rd son, compared to Elizabeth of York. But of course, England was not all that up about a chick sitting on the throne by herself, just like you see in the Targaryan line, that there had been previous struggles about would you give your allegiance to a queen. That it caused the Dance of the Dragons, right? The big battle, the big civil war over the throne. So same thing in England with Henry Tudor and Elizabeth of York. She had the stronger claim, albeit with similar questionable aspects in the background, but she definitely had the stronger claim in bloodline. But they just weren't all up on a woman sitting on the throne. But together as a marriage, there was a potential there because he had won the crown in battle, and she was the female with the line. But he still had to prove himself, and still really, try to put it to bed that he didn't have a claim on there besides this little bastard line. So what he did was, and he had this helper, Cardinal John Morton. That's it. Cardinal John Morton, who he eventually made Archbishop of Canterbury, who was like his serious propagandist. This dude was Tyrion Lannister all the way, right? He made up stories. They were nowhere near the truth. He would tell stories. Nobody would be like, wait, isn't that somebody else's did that? Okay. So in any event, he had cause to be made up a family tree line that swore that he was descended from the ancient kings of Wales, all the way back to Cadwallader. And in fact, that one of his ancestors was King Arthur, because the Welsh at this point believed that King Arthur was actually, he didn't have a title of king exactly, but a battle lord that was of Welsh descent. So the Welsh claimed King Arthur as much as any English did, maybe even more at this point. So he claimed to have this ancient lineage that was more ancient even than the Plantagenets. So he's basically saying to them, screw you and your freaking claim through the Plantagenets, or going back to try to figure out who's descended from William the Conqueror. My lineage was here as kings long before any of you bastards invaded England. And so I think you're going to see that somewhere in the background, whoever the line is, whoever the parentage is of one or both of these people, because Mr. Martin likes to mix it up, is that they're going to claim some super ancient heritage that was long before Aegon the Conqueror ever came back out, right? And, just to top it off, Henry Tudor had really cause to put this in people's faces. So at this point, they don't have TV or magazines or, and books aren't just floating around people. How do you convey this to the general public? So what he did was he had caused to be made a round table that looked like Arthur's round table, and it had the names of the 12 companion knights on it with the Tudor rose in the middle, and then he hung this in Winchester Palace where he held court, right above the throne. So when you walked in and you're walking down this long reception hall, you see in your face this giant round table that was like, I am descended from King Arthur and don't freaking forget it. Now, did people believe it or not? I don't know. But eventually they must have just went along with it because, who said anything about it? Probably because they were scared. He was kind of like the Dark Prince. He was Machiavelli before Machiavelli ever wrote a freaking line of the Prince. In any event, he continued to just like stamp that all over the place, because when Elizabeth of York became pregnant with their first child, he had her go to Winchester Palace. So they were making their progress through the country, but when she became pregnant, he sent her back to Winchester Palace because it was claimed to be one of the ancestral seats of Arthur, King Arthur, that he maybe built it or had a castle there. And then, just to top it off and just icing on the cake, they called their first son Arthur, the once and future king. And it kind of reminds me of this prophecy of the Wood Witch, in which the Wood Witches gave this prophecy to Jaehaerys II, who said that somebody in the line of supposedly his two children, Aerys II and Rhaella, would be the prince that was promised. Or maybe it's the princess. But in any event, I thought about how vague prophecies are in the line. So everybody at that point who received this prophecy thought it would be like their next generation. Whatever child they bore would be the prince or princess that would be promised. But in reality, it doesn't have to be like the next person. It said in that line. So, it could be it could be a grandchild or a great-grandchild. And you think about that in relationship to what happened to the Tudors after Henry Tudor and Elizabeth of York came to the throne. Prince Arthur sadly died at the age of 16 from disease. And then it was their second son, Henry, who became Henry VIII, who definitely made some significant changes in England. And some of them, and did some other crazy freaking stuff, and was sort of like, the stallion that mounted pretty much everybody. But it was eventually his daughter, Elizabeth, who came to the throne that everybody thinks of as, the Elizabethan age was the golden age of England. It was the Renaissance. There was art. There was a lot more peace. They defeated the Spanish Armada, all of this stuff. And she ruled for like 60 years. She was like one of the longest, it was longer than that, one of the longest reigning monarchs in history. And in fact, the three longest reigning monarchs are women. So, prince that was promised, is it this next person, or is it the person after that, or the person after that out of that line? So everybody's looking for this prince. What does it necessarily say about that? Maybe it's the one that brings peace, because when you give birth, after she gave birth to their first child and then to their second male potential heir, it's sort of like, the additional struggle against their rule to take Henry VII off basically kind of dissipated, because they had ensured the dynastic claim. So there's part one, and then I'm going to talk about the how else you could think about who the potential other is, because I'm telling you, it's going to be somebody everybody's freaking shocked about. Thank you very much. I'll talk to you later.